Alright, today I'm going to teach you a little bit more about cosecant and secant graphs. Hopefully yesterday from your Day 6 notes you saw that the graphs for secant and cosecant are actually just based on the graphs for sine and cosine. So the ones you had for homework last night were very basic with just a few changes. Today I'm going to show you the graphs for secant and cosecant when we have all of the different transformations. We're going to pretend like the original equation is just sine. And we'll find amplitude, vertical translation, period, phase shift, intervals, and all of that, just like we did for sine and cosine. Alright, so if we're looking at number 1, the amplitude of this graph is none, because it's actually a U-shaped graph, but in parentheses I'm going to put 3, because that's the number that's in front of cosecant. The vertical translation that's happening is that it's going to be moved down 2. That tells me that the top and bottom of my u's are going to be at -2 plus 3 and -2 minus 3. So 1 and -5. My period is going to be 2 pi divided by 2, just like we do for when we graph sine. So that's going to become pi. My interval is going to be pi over 4. And then my phase shift is going to be pi to the right. Okay, so just like always, I'm going to start with my x-axis. I've got a phase shift, so I'm going to be adding the interval. Since my phase shift is pi to the right, I'm going to start my intervals at pi. That's like 4 pi over 4. Plus 1 gives me 5 pi over 4. Plus 1 gives me 6 pi over 4, which reduces to 3 pi over 2. Plus 1 gives me 7 pi over 4. And plus 1 more gives me 8 pi over 4, which reduces to 2 pi. So my total period is pi, just like I was expecting. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and put these points on my x-axis. Okay, and go ahead and label pi, 5 pi over 4, 3 pi over 2, 7 pi over 4, and 2 pi. Now if I'm thinking about graphing sine, my amplitude is 3, so I'm going to start with that and I'll worry about the vertical translation in a few minutes. So a regular sine graph with an amplitude of 3 is going to start at 0, and it's going to go up, back to home, down, back to home. Now since this graph is shifted with a vertical translation down 2, it's actually going to get moved so that each of these points is shifted down 2. So this is my base graph. And now when I do the shift down 2, I'm going to move each point down 2. Now, even though this is my shifted graph, it's still not my final answer because officially I want the cosecant graph. So what I'm going to do to graph cosecant is I'm going to put asymptotes where my original graph would have hit 0. And even though my shifted graph isn't really hitting 0, my new 0 line is at -2, and that's where my graph would have hit 0. So that's where my asymptotes go. And then I'm going to draw my U-shaped graphs off of my translated sine graph. So this is my graph for cosecant. My asymptotes end up being at pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Alright, now let's try a secant graph. The first thing that they're asking me to do on this secant problem is to factor out the 1/2. Just like we did on Tuesday's notes, we still want to factor out anything that's in front of the x inside the parentheses first. So they're telling me that it's the 1/2. That way I'm left with x plus 1/2 times what is pi over 4? It would be pi over 2. Okay, so this is the equation I'm really working with, and I'm going to pretend that since it's secant, this is really a cosine graph. I'll start with my period. Period is 2 pi divided by 1/2, which really is 2 pi times 2, so I get 4 pi. That means that my interval is going to be 4 pi divided by 4, or just pi. My amplitude is going to be 2 with a flip, but that's what I'm putting in my parentheses. My amplitude for all secant and cosecant graphs is none. But the 2 and a flip is a good reminder for myself when I'm graphing cosine. My vertical translation here is to move the graph up 1. The top and bottom of my u's are going to be at 1 minus 2 and 1 plus negative 2. So that means I'll be at 3 and negative 1. And my phase shift is pi over 2 to the left. Okay, so again, let's start with the x-axis. Since it's pi over 2 to the left, my starting point is going to be negative pi over 2. And I'm going to add pi, which is my interval, 4 times. Okay, so if I need to get common denominators, negative pi over 2 plus 2 pi over 2 gives me positive pi over 2. 2 pi over 2 plus 1 more pi is going to be 3 pi over 2. Plus 1 more pi is 5 pi over 2. Plus 1 more pi is 7 pi over 2. Alright, so I'll start with my x-axis. Notice that 0 is not on my x-axis. So negative pi over 2, positive pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, and 7 pi over 2. Alright, the amplitude for this one was 2, but it was flipped. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that. Amplitude of 2. This is a cosine graph, so I'm going to start my cosine graph, since it's flipped, low. Then I'm going to go to 0, high, 0, low. Okay, this is my base graph for cosine, but I still have to account for my vertical translation, which was up 1. So when I do that, and I move each point up 1, this is my translated cosine graph. Now, because this is secant, again, I'm not starting with a solid cosine graph. This is still my scratch work. I need to see where cosine would have hit 0. That's where I have my asymptotes. So it looks like that happens at pi over 2 and at 5 pi over 2. And then I'm going to draw my U-shaped graphs off of the top of my cosine curve and then off of these pieces. Don't forget you're using the translated cosine curve. Alright, that's what secant and cosecant look like. On this one, my asymptotes happened at x equals pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2. If nothing else tonight, try to graph the original graphs with sine and cosine. If you can at least get that part, going to secant and cosecant, it's just a matter of, instead of connecting in a smooth curve, putting on asymptotes and drawing U-shaped graphs off of those key points. Good luck.